Lionel Tate. In the summer of 1999, a 12-year-old boy walked upstairs in a house in Pembroke Park, Florida, and told the woman watching him that the little girl downstairs had stopped breathing. He said they had been playing. He said it was an accident. A year and a half later, that same boy would become the youngest person in modern American history, sentenced to die in prison. Tiffany Unick was 6 years old. Her mother and Lionel's mother were close friends, the kind who traded babysitting without a second thought. On the night of July 28, 1999, Tiffany was left in the care of Kathleen Grossett Tate, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper, while the two children played downstairs in front of the television. That was the last evening of her life. Lionel was large for his age, somewhere around 170 pounds at 12, and his lawyers would later argue he had the mind of a much younger child. The two of them were watching professional wrestling, the loud, theatrical kind full of body slams and grown men leaping off ropes. About 40 minutes after Kathleen told them to keep the noise down, Lionel came back up the stairs to say something was wrong. What the autopsy revealed turned the case from a tragedy into a prosecution. The injuries were catastrophic. A medical expert testified that the force involved was comparable to a fall from a multi-story building. And no, I'm not making that up. The defense had an explanation ready. They argued that Lionel had only been imitating the wrestling moves he watched on television, that a child had copied what he had seen on a screen and never understood it could kill. The story did not hold together. Lionel's account kept shifting. First, he described one thing, then another, then a third version that involved jumping from the staircase. When his lawyers had him act out what happened, prosecutors pointed out that the spot he described was cluttered with boxes and an exercise machine, which made the entire reenactment physically impossible. The lead prosecutor, Kenneth Padowitz, argued that this had not been one clumsy accident, but a prolonged assault, and under Florida law, that met the standard for first-degree felony murder through aggravated child abuse. No intent to kill was required. The scope of the harm was enough. The defense was handed a deal that should have ended things. 3 years in juvenile detention, then house arrest, then probation. They turned it down, confident a jury would never convict a 12-year-old. On January 25, 2001, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. Days after his 14th birthday, Broward County Circuit Judge Joel Lazarus handed down the only sentence the statute allowed: life without the possibility of parole. From the bench, the judge said that what Lionel had done was not the playful act of a child, but something cold and callous and cruel beyond description. If the story ended there, it would already be one of the most disturbing entries on this list. It did not end there. In 2004, a state appeals court threw out the conviction, ruling that no one had ever properly evaluated whether Lionel was mentally competent to stand trial in the first place. He pleaded to second-degree murder and walked out on house arrest, free before he turned 17. And then came the part almost nobody was rooting for. Within a year, he was caught carrying a knife, a clear violation of his release. Then, in 2005, he robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. The same judge who had sentenced him the first time brought him back into the courtroom and told him plainly that he had finally run out of chances. This time the sentence was 30 years, and unlike the first one, it stuck. As of today, Lionel Tate remains in a Florida prison. The strangest note of grace in the entire case came from Tiffany's own mother, Louise Unick Paul. Even in her grief, she said she felt for the boy who had taken her daughter, because he had been a child too. The case became the national symbol of what it means to try a young child as an adult, and it pushed Florida to write new laws creating other options for juveniles, so that no judge would ever again be boxed into that one terrible sentence. Tate's case forced an uncomfortable question into the open. How young is too young to be called a murderer and locked away for it? 6 years before Lionel ever climbed those stairs, in a small town in upstate New York, another child had already handed the country a far darker version of that exact question. Eric Smith. Derek Roby was 4 years old, and that August morning was the first time his mother ever let him walk the single block to summer recreation by himself. He never made it. The boy who stopped him along the way was 13, and for a long time, nobody in that town could believe a child that age was capable of what came next. Derek was the kind of little boy who knew the route by heart, a block from his front door to the program where the neighborhood kids spent their summer mornings. His mother, Doreen Roby, watched him set off on his own for the very first time on August 2nd, 1993, in the village of Savona. Minutes later, he was gone. That single decision, the ordinary act of letting a 4-year-old walk a familiar block, is the kind of thing a parent never forgives themselves for, even when no reasonable person would ever blame them. The boy who intercepted him was Eric Smith. By every account, Eric had spent his own childhood as a target. He was bullied relentlessly for his red hair, his freckles, his glasses, his ears, and he carried a temper that experts would later try to name as a kind of explosive rage disorder. He lured Derek off the path and into a patch of woods with the promise of a shortcut. There, he took the little boy's life. What investigators found at the scene was so disturbing that their first assumption was that the killer had to be an adult, a stranger passing through, someone from out of town. The idea that a 13-year-old neighbor was responsible did not occur to anyone. It was Eric's own behavior in the days afterward that gave him away. A family friend noticed something off and alerted his mother, who brought him to investigators. Days later, he confessed. Steuben County tried him as an adult. His attorney, Kevin Bradley, argued that Eric was not a calculating killer, but a deeply damaged child in the grip of a disorder he could not control. The prosecutor, John Tunney, argued the opposite, that what happened in those woods was deliberate and chosen, not a seizure of rage. On August 16, 1994, the jury sided with the prosecution and convicted Eric of second-degree murder. That November, County Court Judge Donald Purple imposed the maximum a court could give a juvenile in New York, 9 years to life. Because the sentence carried the possibility of parole, Eric's real fight would not be in the courtroom. It would be in front of a parole board, again and again, for the next 2 decades. He was denied 10 times. The board kept pointing to public safety and to the unwavering opposition of Derek's family. And at a hearing in 2004, Eric said something that haunted the proceedings for years afterward. He admitted that hurting Derek had, in the moment, felt good, that for once in his life he had been the one inflicting pain instead of absorbing it, and he acknowledged he might well have done it again. You would think an admission like that would close the door for good. For a long time it did. Then, on his 11th appearance before the board, on October 5, 2021, the answer finally changed. By then, Eric had spent more than 27 years inside, with a clean disciplinary record and a risk assessment the board rated as low. They granted him parole. On February 1, 2022, he walked out of prison and resettled in Queens, where he remains on parole for the rest of his life. The Roby family and the people of Savona protested the release, and a statue of Derek still stands today over a memorial ball field, a small boy frozen in bronze who never got the chance to grow up. Eric Smith took a life, and the entire argument over his sentence centered on what he had done in those woods. The next boy on this list never killed anyone at all, and yet a judge looked at him and decided he should die behind bars anyway. Joe Sullivan. There were only 2 children in the entire country serving life without the possibility of parole for a crime that was not a killing. Both of them were 13. Both of them were in Florida, and one of them was a boy named Joe Sullivan. Joe was a mentally disabled child who had already been failed by nearly every adult in his life. By 13, he carried a long juvenile record and a history of abuse at home that the courts would later acknowledge in detail. In 1989, in Pensacola, he and 2 older teenagers, one 17 and one 15, broke into the home of a 72-year-old woman. Later that same day, the woman was sexually assaulted in a brutal attack. She never saw the face of the person who did it. She could only describe a young attacker by the sound of his voice. One of the 2 older boys named Joe as the one responsible. Both of those older teenagers, the ones who could have been tried as adults, received only juvenile sentences. The 13-year-old took the fall. His trial lasted a single day. The proceedings were saturated with references to race. The victim's identification of Joe rested on a voice comparison that had been rehearsed with the prosecutor beforehand, and the biological evidence that might have settled the question was never DNA tested and was later destroyed. His court-appointed lawyer, who would eventually be disbarred, filed an appeal claiming there were no issues worth challenging. Let me put that more plainly. A 13-year-old with an intellectual disability was convicted in a one-day trial on evidence that was never scientifically tested, defended by a lawyer who told the court there was nothing to argue. And the judge, Nicholas Geeker, told the courtroom that the boy in front of him was beyond help, and that he intended to send him away for as long as the law would possibly allow. He was true to his word. Joe was shipped to adult prison at 14, where he was repeatedly victimized, and where he would later develop multiple sclerosis and lose the use of his legs, eventually relying on a wheelchair. For most of 2 decades, that was simply the end of the story. Then a lawyer named Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, took Joe's case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He argued it in November of 2009, alongside a companion case called Graham versus Florida. Stevenson stood before the justices and said that to tell any child of 13 that he is fit only to die in prison is, by definition, cruel. On May 17, 2010, the court agreed in the Graham decision, ruling that life without parole is unconstitutional for juveniles convicted of crimes that did not involve a killing. That ruling reached straight back to Joe. He was one of only 2 13-year-olds in the nation serving that sentence for a non-homicide, and both of them, as it happened, were sitting in Florida prisons. His sentence was invalidated. He was resentenced to 2 consecutive 40-year terms, and after years of further litigation over how his time should be credited, he was released on December 1, 2017, after 25 years behind bars, into a re-entry program run by the same organization that had freed him. To this day, his lawyers maintain that Joe may have been innocent of the assault altogether. Convicted on the word of an older boy who had every reason to shift the blame downward. We will likely never know for certain, because the evidence that could have answered it is gone. Joe Sullivan's case helped end life sentences for children who had never killed anyone. But it left a harder question completely untouched. What about the kids who were standing in the room when someone died, even if their own hand never pulled the trigger? In a video store in Arkansas, a 14-year-old boy was about to become the answer to that question for the entire country. Kuntrell Jackson. Contrell Jackson was 14 years old, and he never fired the gun that killed the woman behind the counter. He did not even bring it. But under Arkansas law at the time, none of that mattered, and the sentence waiting for him was identical to the one you would hand the shooter himself: life, with no way out, ever. On November 18, 1999, Contrell and two other teenagers, one 14 and one 15, set out to rob a movie rental store in Blytheville. It was only on the way there that Contrell realized one of the other boys, Derek Shields, had a sawed-off shotgun hidden in his coat sleeve. At first, Contrell stayed outside. The clerk working that day was a woman named Lori Troop. When she refused to hand over money and mentioned calling the police, Shields shot and killed her. The three of them fled, and in the end, they left with nothing at all. There has always been a dispute about what Contrell said in those moments, whether he encouraged the robbery or whether he was as stunned as anyone. What was never in dispute is that he did not fire the gun, and under the felony murder doctrine, it did not have to be his finger on the trigger. Arkansas charged him as an adult with capital felony murder and aggravated robbery. His request to be moved to juvenile court was denied. In July of 2003, a jury convicted him, and that conviction carried a single automatic consequence, with no room for a judge to weigh his age, his role, or anything else about him. Mandatory life without parole. That phrase is the entire reason this case matters. The judge was not allowed to consider that Contrell was 14. He was not allowed to consider that Contrell had not been the shooter. The law took the most severe sentence on the books and applied it automatically, the same way it would to a grown man who had planned and carried out an execution. That is not a typo, by the way. The 14-year-old accomplice and the adult triggerman would walk into the same cell for the same forever. The Equal Justice Initiative challenged it, and the Arkansas Supreme Court upheld the sentence in early 2011. So the case climbed higher, and the United States Supreme Court combined it with another case out of Alabama under a name that would become one of the most consequential in American sentencing history: Miller versus Alabama. On June 25, 2012, by a vote of 5-4, the court struck the practice down. Writing for the majority, Justice Elena Kagan explained that mandatory sentences, by their very nature, force a court to ignore the things that make a child different from an adult. They erase the distance between the 17-year-old and the 14-year-old, between the shooter and the accomplice, and the Eighth Amendment does not permit that. The ruling reshaped sentencing across the country. At the time, more than 2,500 prisoners nationwide were serving life without parole for crimes they had committed as juveniles, dozens of them age 14 or younger, and the decision struck down mandatory juvenile life statutes in roughly 29 states in a single stroke. For Contrell himself, it meant a new sentence. He was resentenced to 20 years and released on parole on February 21, 2017. Not long after, Arkansas removed life without parole as an option for juveniles entirely. Contrell Jackson's case rewrote the rules for children like him all over America. But there was one man, locked away decades before any of the boys on this list were even born, who had been waiting in a Louisiana penitentiary for more than half a century. And it was his name, not theirs, that would end up on the ruling that finally reached back through time for every single one of them. If you're getting something out of this video and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time to do it. It genuinely helps the channel keep these stories coming. Henry Montgomery. Henry Montgomery was 17 years old when he was caught skipping school on a November afternoon in 1963. He had a small pistol on him, and when the deputy who stopped him reached out to search him, Henry panicked and fired. By the time he finally walked out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, he was 75, and nearly everyone he had ever known on the outside was already gone. The man he killed was Charles Hurt, a deputy with the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office, 40 years old. He had been looking into a reported theft near the high school in Scotlandville when he crossed paths with the truant teenager. He left behind 3 children. In the segregated Louisiana of that year, the killing of a white deputy by a black teenager set an entire parish on edge. Henry was a 10th grader, a black kid cutting class in a town where that alone could draw the wrong kind of attention. When Deputy Hurt stopped to frisk him, Henry pulled a .22 caliber pistol and fired a single shot. He was arrested, and the machinery of the era moved fast. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1964. That first conviction did not survive. In 1966, the Louisiana Supreme Court annulled the verdict, finding that the atmosphere around the trial had made a fair hearing impossible. More than 60 black men had been rounded up at roadblocks in the aftermath. Crosses had been burned in the area, and the court concluded that prejudice had poisoned the whole proceeding. At one point, Henry escaped from the parish jail, though he was recaptured within hours. He was retried in 1969, and this time the jury returned a verdict of guilty without capital punishment, which under Louisiana law triggered an automatic sentence of life without parole. The conviction was affirmed in 1970, and then Henry Montgomery simply vanished into Angola, the largest maximum security prison in the country, for what everyone assumed would be the rest of his life. But something happened across those decades that the law had never accounted for. Henry became, by every account, a model prisoner. He coached the prison boxing team. He worked in the silk screen shop. He took younger inmates under his wing, the ones who reminded him of the frightened kid he had once been. Over 57 years inside, he built up almost no disciplinary record at all. When the Supreme Court decided Miller versus Alabama in 2012, the same ruling that had reached Contrell Jackson, Henry's lawyers argued it should reach him too. Louisiana refused, insisting the decision only applied going forward and could not stretch back to a man sentenced in the 1960s. So the question of whether Miller applied to old cases climbed all the way back to the Supreme Court, this time carrying Henry's own name. On January 25, 2016, in Montgomery versus Louisiana, the court ruled 6-3 that the protection had to apply retroactively. With a single decision, it reached back through time, by some counts to more than 2,600 people who had been told as children that they would die behind bars. Even then, freedom did not come easily. Henry was denied parole in 2018 and again in 2019. Finally, on November 17, 2021, the Louisiana Parole Board voted 3-0 to release him at the age of 75. After more than 57 years. One board member laid out the reasoning plainly, pointing to the decades served, the spotless record, the low risk he posed, and the warden's own good words about the man. 2 of Deputy Hurt's daughters had met Henry over the years and told him they forgave him. Another daughter, Linda Hurt Woods, opposed his release to the very end. He spent his final years living quietly with the help of a re-entry program, sitting down with young people to talk about the road he never got the chance to walk. Henry Montgomery's name ended up on the ruling that freed people he would never meet, and his case asked how long a child should keep paying for the worst thing they ever did. The story that comes next asks something even harder. What is the right sentence for a child when the person they killed was the same person who had spent years destroying them? Sarah Cruzan. By the time Sarah Cruzan was 16, The man she shot had already been part of her life for 5 years. He found her when she was 11, and almost no one in the courtroom that sent her away for the rest of her life was ever allowed to hear what he had done to her in all the time in between. Sarah grew up in Riverside, California, raised by a mother who was addicted and abusive. She was sexually abused as a young child, and she cycled in and out of foster care and psychiatric hospitals before she was even a teenager. When she was 11, she met a man named George Howard, who went by GG, and he presented himself as a mentor, someone who finally cared about her. What he was actually doing was grooming her. By the time she was 13, he had raped her and put her out on the streets, trafficking a child for sex. On March 10, 1994, when Sarah was 16, she shot and killed George Howard in a motel room in Riverside. By her own account, the plan had not been hers. She testified that she had been pressured into it by an older ex-convict tied to her boyfriend, a man who ordered her to rob and kill Howard and threatened to kill her and her mother if she refused. She met Howard at the Dynasty Suites Motel, shot him, and left with $1,500 and his car keys. She did not get far. She had left her identification and her purse behind in the room, and within days a warrant was out and she was under arrest. She confessed. What happened next is the part her supporters have never been able to forgive. A California Youth Authority evaluation found her suitable for the juvenile system, for treatment rather than an adult prison. But at the urging of prosecutor Tim Freer, a judge moved her case into adult court regardless. And once she was there, the years of abuse and trafficking that had shaped every part of her were largely kept away from the jury. The prosecutor even warned the jurors not to let her young appearance sway them. On May 11, 1995, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole, plus 4 years. She was 17. For more than a decade, that was where things sat. Then, in 2009, an interview Sarah gave from prison to Human Rights Watch made its way online, and her case caught fire. People watched a composed, thoughtful young woman calmly describe what had been done to her as a child, and they could not reconcile it with a sentence built for the worst killers alive. There is a reason her case is still talked about today. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence in early 2011, cutting it to 25 years to life. She was resentenced again, to 19 years to life. Governor Jerry Brown approved her parole, and on October 31, 2013, after roughly 18 years inside, Sarah Kruzan walked out. She did not stop there. In 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom granted her a full pardon. By then, she had written a memoir about her life and become an advocate for others trapped in the same machinery that had nearly swallowed her, helping push for changes in how California treats young people who kill their abusers. A state senator who studied her case said it stood as a near-perfect example of a child failed by every adult who was supposed to protect her. Sarah Kruzan's defenders spent years arguing that the system had refused to see her as a victim. A few decades earlier, and most of the way across the country in Pennsylvania, the system had refused to grant a different girl something even more basic. It had refused to see her as a child at all. Trina Garnett. Trina Garnett was 14 years old, could not read or write, and had spent years being told by doctors that she did not have the mental capacity to understand a courtroom. Pennsylvania tried her as an adult anyway, and the sentence it handed down would keep her locked away for the next 43 years. The two people who died were brothers. Brian Harvey was 13, and Derek Harvey was 6, the sons of a woman named Sylvia Harvey, who had told her boys to stay away from Trina. They lived in a row house on Spruce Street in Chester, Pennsylvania. On a night in late August of 1976, that house caught fire, and neither boy made it out. To understand how a 14-year-old ended up at the center of it, you have to understand the life she had already lived. Trina was the youngest of 12 children. Her mother died when she was 9. Her father was a violent alcoholic. She had an IQ measured at around 69, could not read or write, struggled with a severe speech impediment, and had already spent years moving in and out of psychiatric institutions. By the time of the fire, she was essentially homeless and foraging for food, and she had been disfigured by burns as a small child. This is who the state of Pennsylvania decided to try as a fully responsible adult. Around 1:40 in the morning, Trina and a 16-year-old friend climbed through a window of the Harvey home, the same home the boy's mother had forbidden her from coming near. By Trina's account, she lit matches only to see in the dark. The house caught fire. The two boys did not survive it, and Trina insisted, then and for the rest of her life, that it had been an accident and that she never meant for anyone to be hurt. What happened in court is the part that still unsettles legal scholars. Multiple court-appointed psychiatrists examined Trina and found her incompetent to stand trial. Reviewing courts found she lacked the capacity to even form an intent to kill, and she was tried as an adult regardless. Her 16-year-old friend testified against her in exchange for having her own charges dropped. Trina was convicted of second-degree felony murder for deaths that occurred in the course of a burglary and a fire. Her court-appointed lawyer, much like Joe Sullivan's, was later disbarred. You would think someone in that process would have said something. Nobody did. The sentence was mandatory life without parole. The trial judge, Howard Reed, called it one of the saddest cases he had ever sat through, and noted that the state did not even have a facility equipped to protect a defendant as young and as vulnerable as the girl in front of him. She was sent to an adult women's prison at 15. There, she was raped by a male guard and became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son who was taken from her and placed into foster care. Like Joe Sullivan, she would later develop multiple sclerosis and spend her final years of incarceration in a wheelchair. For decade after decade, no one was coming for Trina Garnett. Then the Equal Justice Initiative filed a petition on her behalf in 2008, and after Miller came down in 2012, the door finally cracked open. She was resentenced in February of 2018, and in November of 2019, she was released from the prison at Muncie after roughly 43 years inside. Her case became a touchstone in the fight over juvenile life sentences, written about in the national press and featured in Brian Stevenson's book about the people the system had simply discarded. Pennsylvania, as it happened, had been holding more juvenile lifers than any other state in the country. Trina Garnett's case turned on a wrenching question: whether a child who could not read could ever truly grasp what she had done. The final story on this list turns on something simpler and somehow even sadder. Two brothers, an afternoon of roughhousing that went too far, and a family that lost both of its sons on the very same day. Quantel Lotz. Quantel Lotz and his stepbrother Michael were close. The kind of close where wrestling around the house was just how they spent an afternoon. One of those afternoons ended with Michael gone, and Quantel, at 14 years old, on his way to a sentence of life without parole. And the person who would fight hardest to free him was Michael's own mother. Michael Barton was 17, 3 years older than Quantel, and by every account the two were inseparable. They did not think of themselves as stepbrothers. They thought of themselves as brothers, plain and simple. That is part of what makes this one so hard to sit with. Quantel's start in life had been brutal. He grew up in a St. Louis crack house, where his mother used and sold drugs. He was pulled into foster care at 8 years old, arriving with decayed teeth, old scars, and the marks of deep neglect, and he was sexually abused as a child. Eventually, he was reunited with his father, who moved the family in with a woman named Tammy and her son Michael. For the first time in his life, Quantel had something close to a real home, and a brother who looked out for him. On November 14th, 1999, the two boys were goofing around the way they always did, a game with a blow dart and a toy bow and arrow that started as nothing at all. It escalated. What began as roughhousing turned into a real fight, and before either of them understood what was happening, Michael had been fatally wounded. He was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. Quantel was 14 years and 21 days old. Missouri tried him as an adult in Farmington. In November of 2002, a jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting him of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Less than 2 hours. That's not a typo, by the way. Circuit Judge Kenneth Pratt handed down the mandatory sentence, life without the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive life term for the armed charge. The moment was so charged that after the sentencing, Quantel's own father erupted in the courtroom and had to be physically restrained and arrested. Quantel, for his part, was so certain his life was over that a few years into his sentence, he had 2 words tattooed down his forearms in heavy Gothic script, 1 word on each arm. Dead man. That, he later said, was exactly how he felt. Already dead, at 14. Through all of it, one person never turned on him. Tammy, Michael's biological mother and Quantel's stepmother, refused to accept that the boy she had helped raise was a murderer in any meaningful sense. She said the two had loved each other like brothers, that they had always taken care of each other, and she spent years working alongside lawyers to win his release, rather than see him die in a cell for the death of her son. The Equal Justice Initiative took his case, and after Miller in 2012 and Montgomery in 2016, his mandatory sentence was no longer constitutional. Rather than resentence every juvenile lifer one by one, Missouri passed a law in 2016 making those who committed their crimes under the age of 18 eligible for parole after 25 years. For Quantel, that 25-year mark arrived around November of 2024. As of the most recent reporting that can be confirmed, he was still in the Missouri prison system. His parole eligibility newly arrived, but no release yet on the record. He married a woman named Ingrid in 2011, while still behind bars, and the boy who once believed he was already dead has spent years insisting he is no longer the 14-year-old who walked into that courtroom. That's all 8. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.